A protagonist is a character that. Okay, now you must be wondering what it is. Don't worry, Gemspeare will explain it, so you never ever forget it again. A protagonist is the leading character in movies, dramas, films, play scripts, etc. A protagonist is the main or major character in a play, film, novel, etc. A character that is at the center of the story and whose decisions fuel the plot is known as a protagonist. Protos is a Greek word that means first in importance, whereas agonist comes from a Greek word agonists that means actor. It can be a positive as well as negative character. I will share examples of famous Hollywood movies protagonists. Al Capone, Tom Hardy, in Capone. Grace, Riley Keough, in The Lodge. Macaulay Culkin as Kevin McAllister in Home Alone. Sylvester Stallone as Rocky Balboa in Rocky. Malcolm McDowell as Alex Delarge in A Clockwork Orange. Johnny Depp as Captain Jack Sparrow in Pirates of the Caribbean. Now I will give examples from famous novels. Sherlock Holmes, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Elizabeth Bennet, Pride and Prejudice. Atticus Finch, To Kill a Mockingbird. Jane Eyre. Fitzwilliam Darcy, Pride and Prejudice. Willy Wonka, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Roald Dahl. Examples of protagonist from literature. Example number 1. Hamlet, by William Shakespeare. Protagonist examples in many stories are not shown to be flawless. They generally undergo some change that causes a turn of events. This makes a story interesting and helps deliver a message. Sometimes, a moral weakness shows that causes the fall of the protagonist. For example, in William Shakespeare's play Hamlet, the protagonist experiences terrible events because of his indecisiveness, which troubles him while murdering his evil uncle. So, Hamlet's struggle in dealing with the antagonist is what precedes the story. Example number 2, As I Lay Dying, by William Faulkner. There are ensemble stories that do not particularly highlight either one of the characters more than the rest. For instance, Addie Bundren's demise in the novel As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner results in her family traveling a long way to bury her, and they all tell the story from their own perspectives, which makes them all equally important to the story. Thus, it leaves us with more than one protagonist in the same story. Protagonist example from cinema. Example, Star Wars, by George Lucas. George Lucas develops the character of Luke Skywalker in the movie Star Wars. He plays an outwardly naive farm boy. Luke desperately wants a life different from his monotonous existence. After his uncle's and aunt's demise, he has no other choice but to join forces with Obi-Wan Kenobi. Luke later matures to understand the customs of the Force. His antagonist in the movie is Darth Vader, who turns out to be Luke's father. They both get into a major conflict, but eventually Luke succeeds. The function of a protagonist. A protagonist is a very important tool to develop a story. There are different terms for a protagonist, such as hero, focal character, central character, and main character. Regardless of what title you give a protagonist, he or she remains the key ingredient in the development of the story, which is why the story revolves around him or her. More often than not, the protagonist is fair and virtuous and is always supporting the moral good. Further in the plot, the protagonist may undergo some change, which will probably be the climax of the story. Being the central element puts grave responsibilities on the shoulders of a protagonist. Since the story revolves around the protagonist, he is the one who has to work as an emotional heart of the story, helping the audience connect with it on a basic level. A well-constructed protagonist attracts the audience emotionally. It helps them relate to the joys, fears, and hopes of the character in the story. The events occurring in a story are always viewed from the perspective of the protagonist. The audience decides whether or not a particular event is favorable in a story. A wedding is an important and positive event in The Sound of Music because it is a positive event for the protagonist, Maria. However, the same kind of event in the movie While You Were Sleeping would be unfortunate because in that case the protagonist Lucy was marrying the wrong person. Some stories weave many characters into an ensemble story, But even in such stories, there is often one character that is more important to the story than the rest. For instance, in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, there are many characters that have great significance to the story, but Frodo Baggins is the one who stands out because everyone else's destiny rests in his hands. Why do writers use protagonists? The protagonist is an incredibly important part of a story. They are necessary in order for writers to develop their plot lines. The story revolves around them and their character development. Writers have to be skilled enough to create an interesting protagonist without them being too perfect or ideal. Their characterization must be multi-layered to allow them to change over time. Often, the climax of a story corresponds with an important change in the protagonist's outlook, abilities, etc. It's the protagonist's job to pull the reader into the story and make them root for this person's future. Protagonist and antagonist. Protagonists and antagonists are usually paired together as two sides of the same coin. One is not whole without the other, just like Joker and Batman. Okay, so, without an antagonist, the protagonist would not have anything to fight back against or overcome. The antagonist, on the other hand, would not have anyone standing in the way of their goals. Some of the most famous pairings of protagonist and antagonists are Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty, Harry Potter and Voldemort, Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader the Sith, Frodo Baggins and the Ring Sauron, Elizabeth Bennet and her own Pride and Prejudice, Captain Ahab and the Whale, Batman and the Joker. Misconception: a protagonist is always a positive character in a play, film, novel, etc. No. It can be a negative character. Examples: a protagonist can be an evil character or a character that is not liked by our society. Sometimes the villain protagonist will start evil and become a better person at the end. Other times they will remain evil throughout, stuck in their ways. Sometimes they might even start out as a hero and descend into villainy. Here are some examples of villainous protagonists: Alex from A Clockwork Orange, Patrick Bateman from American Psycho, the Grinch from How the Grinch Stole Christmas. Sometimes an evil protagonist undergoes a transformative character arc to become good in the end, as with the Grinch. However, sometimes they remain just as monstrous as ever, often a sign of sociopathy, as in the first two examples. If you're writing a villainous protagonist, just remember that, even if they don't get a redemption arc, they still need to be compelling to readers in some way. Perhaps they have a delightfully twisted inner monologue or a weakness that they fear will be found out. Can a character be a protagonist and an antagonist? Sometimes, there is no clear distinction of whether a character is a protagonist or an antagonist. Whether their intentions are unknown, their actions are both positive and negative, or they are their own worst enemy, a primary character can be both a protagonist and an antagonist at the same time. The protagonist isn't necessarily virtuous and also may be just one of many protagonists. Every narrative will have at least one protagonist who may serve as the narrator as well. If not, the story will typically follow them in third person limited. Alternately, if there are multiple protagonists, the point of view often shifts back and forth, whether that's in first person or third person limited. It may be difficult to identify the protagonist or protagonists immediately, but you usually know within a few chapters. Types of protagonists. 1. Lonely hero. The lonely hero is the standard strain of protagonist, probably because it's seen as the most heroic type. As the name implies, the lonely hero is the one and only person who can stop evil from triumphing and save the day. Though they're usually helped by a team of supporting characters, the ultimate burden of the quest falls squarely on the shoulders of the lonely hero. They are the one who must sacrifice the most in order to accomplish their goal. Examples of lonely hero protagonists: Harry from Harry Potter, Katniss Everdeen from The Hunger Games, Frodo Baggins from Lord of the Rings, Matilda from Matilda, Cooper from Interstellar. 2. Group hero. With group hero protagonists, multiple people are equally involved in the story's main events and conflict. They may not all serve the same purpose or perform the same tasks, but they pull together to accomplish a single goal. No one person stands out beyond the rest, or if they do, it's only because the group helped them get there. Whereas the lonely hero can, and ultimately does, rise to the occasion alone. Examples of group hero protagonists: Romeo and Juliet from Romeo and Juliet. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny from A Series of Unfortunate Events. Fred, Daphne, Velma, Shaggy, and Scooby from Scooby-Doo. Abilene Clark, Minnie Jackson, and Eugenia Skeeter Phelan from The Help. The Avengers, from the Marvel Comics of the same name. 3. Anti-hero. Although protagonists are usually shown as selfless, kind, and courageous heroes, they can also be bitter, sarcastic, and perhaps less than morally upright. In other words, they might be an anti-hero, a hero without typically heroic traits. An anti-hero often starts out as either an impartial party or a lesser villain who begrudgingly engages in conflict with the main antagonist, usually because there's something in it for them. However, their lack of truly malevolent convictions typically means that they end up in more neutral or even good territory, if only by accident. Anti-heroes frequently feature in works of grimdark, which specialize in morally gray characters and situations. Examples of anti-hero protagonists: Artemis from Artemis Fowl. Holden Caulfield from The Catcher in the Rye. Locke Lamora from the Gentleman Bastards series. Thomas Covenant from the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. So what would a protagonist be without an antagonist? Dear. If you are wondering what an antagonist is, then wait for our upcoming video on it. Do like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.